They called it the Ship of Dreams, the unsinkable Titanic, a floating palace of steel and luxury, gliding through a moonless Atlantic night. Inside, laughter, music, and champagne. Above, a sky full of stars. But beneath that calm ocean, something deadly waited. The air was freezing, the sea like black glass. Warnings were ignored. Pride took the wheel, and fate tightened its grip. When the lookout finally whispered, "Iceberg, right ahead," it was already too late. The Titanic wasn't just sinking, it was breaking the illusion of safety, power, and control. In less than 3 hours, more than 1,500 lives would vanish into the icy dark. If you were there that night, no lights, no warmth, no escape, would you have survived? Don't be so sure, because even the strongest hearts froze on the Titanic's final night. So before we begin, let me ask you this. How's your day going so far? And we'd also love to know, where are you listening from tonight? It means a lot to us to feel connected with you, no matter where in the world you are. And if you've had a long or stressful day, here's what I want you to do. Put on your headphones, lie back on your bed, close your eyes, and just let yourself sink into our story. Let it carry the weight of the day away so you can feel a little lighter, a little calmer, and a lot more free. It was April 14th, 1912. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction, a calm, glassy sea under a sky filled with stars so clear it looked almost unreal. And cutting through that frozen silence was the greatest ship mankind had ever built, the RMS Titanic. To the world, it was more than a vessel. It was a symbol of progress, pride, and power. At 882 feet long, the Titanic was a floating city, filled with the most advanced technology of its time. Electric lights, a wireless radio, grand staircases that shimmered under golden chandeliers. It wasn't just a ship. It was a declaration that humans had conquered nature itself. The passengers on board believed it. They believed nothing could touch them here, not the ocean, not the cold, not even fate. On the upper decks, laughter filled the night. The first-class dining room was alive with music and conversation, men in crisp tuxedos, and women draped in silk and diamonds, toasted to their good fortune. Waiters glided between tables, carrying crystal glasses and silver trays. The band played soft waltzes as the hum of voices blended with the rhythmic heartbeat of the ship's engines. Everywhere you looked, there was beauty. Polished mahogany, gilded ceilings, carpets thick as clouds. It was said the Titanic's grand staircase could make even royalty feel small, and for many, it did. Upstairs, the wealthy sipped champagne and discussed politics, art, and the promise of America, a land where even their riches could grow richer. Down below, in third class, a different kind of dream unfolded. There, families huddled in narrow cabins, their few belongings packed into worn leather trunks. They weren't chasing luxury. They were chasing hope, a new beginning, a better life. For them, the Titanic wasn't a symbol of pride. It was salvation on steel hulls. But no matter who they were, rich or poor, everyone aboard that ship shared one belief. The Titanic was unsinkable, and that belief would be their greatest mistake. At 9 p.m., the temperature outside had dropped below freezing. The ship's captain, Edward Smith, stood on the bridge staring into the dark. He'd received several iceberg warnings throughout the day, 6 in total, all from nearby ships, but each report had been dismissed as precaution. After all, the Titanic's hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. Even if 4 of them flooded, she could still stay afloat. That's what the designers said. That's what the world believed. So the ship pressed forward, full speed ahead. 22 knots, through a sea of invisible danger. Up in the crow's nest, 2 lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, kept watch. The air was so cold, it burned their lungs with every breath. Their eyes strained against the horizon, searching for shapes that shouldn't be there. But the night was unusually dark. There was no moon, no waves, nothing to make the icebergs stand out. The sea was flat and still, a mirror reflecting the stars. A perfect night, they said. But perfection can be deceptive. Down below, in the boiler rooms, men worked half-naked in blistering heat, shoveling coal into massive furnaces. The roar of the engines drowned out everything. Sweat dripped from their faces as the floor vibrated beneath their boots. For them, the Titanic wasn't elegance. It was labor. The heartbeat of the ship came from their hands. Meanwhile, above deck, a gentle wind brushed through the promenade. Couples strolled arm in arm, admiring the stars. Some passengers gathered around, marveling at the sight of ice forming on the railings. It was beautiful, they said, like diamonds under moonlight. They didn't know those diamonds were warnings. At 10:00 p.m., the final mailbags were sorted in the lower decks. The Titanic carried not just people, but letters, goods, even dreams written in ink, all destined for New York. The wireless operators worked nonstop, sending messages of excitement from passengers to friends and families waiting across the ocean. But among those messages, a few critical ones, the iceberg warnings, went unanswered. The operators were too busy sending personal telegrams for the wealthy guests. The words, "ice field ahead," were just another note, lost in the noise. Upstairs, in the smoking lounge, a group of gentlemen laughed over cigars and brandy. John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men on earth, told his friends the Titanic was so safe, he'd rather be on her than in heaven. They all laughed. The ship gave a soft, reassuring hum beneath their feet. Steady, invincible. In the first-class cabins, the women prepared for bed. They brushed their hair, whispered about the parties they'd attend once they reached America, the new dresses they'd wear in New York. In steerage, a young Irish girl named Maggie lay awake, listening to the muffled music above her. She thought about her brother, waiting in Boston. She thought about the life she was about to begin. She didn't know that in just 2 hours, she'd be fighting for it. 8 p.m. The cold had turned vicious. Frost crept along the decks. The wind howled low, like a warning no one could hear. In the crow's nest, the lookouts rubbed their hands together, stamping their feet to stay warm. Their binoculars had been misplaced before departure. No one ever found them. All they could rely on were their eyes and the faint reflection of starlight on the water. The Titanic sailed on, full speed, her engines pounding rhythmically through the night. Inside, most passengers were asleep. The few who remained awake had no reason to worry. The ship's vibrations felt like a lullaby, a steady heartbeat of safety. Captain Smith, calm and confident, had just retired to his quarters. In the wireless room, one last message came through from a nearby ship, the Californian. "Dense ice field ahead. We are stopped for the night." The Titanic's operator, Jack Phillips, tapped back impatiently. "Shut up, I'm busy." And with that, the last warning of the night went ignored. 30 p.m. The sea was silent. The stars shimmered cold and distant. On the horizon, a faint, dark shape began to emerge, almost invisible against the black water. The lookouts leaned forward, squinting. At first, it looked like a shadow or a trick of the light. But as the Titanic drew closer, that shadow grew larger, clearer, a jagged, ghostly wall rising from the sea. Frederick Fleet's heart stopped. He grabbed the bell rope and rang 3 times, the signal for danger ahead. Then he shouted down the phone, "Iceberg, right ahead." The officer on the bridge repeated the words, frozen for a split second. Then barked the command, "Hard a starboard." The helmsman spun the wheel. Far below, the engines reversed with a deafening roar, but the Titanic was too big, too fast, too proud. She began to turn, but not fast enough. At 11:40 p.m., the iceberg scraped along the starboard side. The sound wasn't loud. It was a low, grinding whisper, steel bending, rivets snapping. Passengers felt a slight tremor beneath their feet, like the ship had run over something small. In the dining room, a few glasses rattled. Someone laughed. No one screamed. Then, slowly, water began to pour into the lowest compartments. Unstoppable, invisible. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was called to inspect the damage. He moved from one flooded room to the next, his face growing pale. After a few minutes, he whispered the words no one wanted to hear. "She will sink." But above deck, the illusion still held. The lights still glowed. The band still played. Passengers kept drinking, dancing, talking, unaware that beneath their feet, the ocean had already begun its quiet revenge. The Titanic continued gliding forward, majestic as ever, cutting through the night like nothing had happened. But deep below, the truth was spreading fast, from the boiler rooms to the bridge. And by the time anyone truly understood what was happening, it would already be too late. The greatest ship in history had met its match, not in war, not in fire, but in ice. And for the 2,000 souls aboard, the grand illusion was about to shatter forever. The clock struck 11:40 p.m. when destiny finally arrived. The lookout's desperate cry still echoed in the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead." In that instant, the calm night shattered. Orders flew across the deck. "Hard a starboard, full astern." The helmsman turned the wheel with all his strength, the massive ship groaning as if it were alive. The engines roared, the propellers churned, and the Titanic began to veer left, slowly, painfully slowly. But momentum is a cruel master. At 22 knots, the Titanic wasn't just moving forward, it was charging through fate itself. The iceberg loomed closer, its jagged white body glowing under starlight, towering like a frozen monster from the deep. It wasn't a mountain of ice, it was a wall, and the Titanic was heading straight for it. For one fleeting second, it seemed the ship might clear it. The passengers on deck held their breath. The dark shape slipped past, silent and eerie. Then came the sound, a deep, sickening scrape, like steel screaming in pain. A vibration rippled through the entire ship. Not a crash, not an explosion, but a grinding whisper that sent chills through every bolt and beam. The iceberg tore open the ship's hull below the waterline. Not a single gash, but a series of wounds. Plates buckled, rivets popped, and seawater burst through the openings with unstoppable force. 5 compartments flooded within minutes. The ship was mortally wounded, though hardly anyone knew it yet. On the upper decks, passengers felt a faint tremor beneath their feet. In the first-class smoking lounge, a few men paused their card game. Someone joked that the captain must have hit a whale. Laughter followed, and the cards continued to shuffle. Down below, it was no joke. In the mailroom, clerks felt cold water rush around their ankles. Within seconds, the icy flood was knee-deep. They scrambled to save the bags of mail, hundreds of them, as the water climbed higher and higher. In the boiler rooms, a deafening roar filled the air. As the seawater burst through the bulkhead doors, men shouted over the noise, some climbing ladders, others trapped in rising black water. The heat from the furnaces turned to steam as the cold water hit. The stench of coal and seawater filled their lungs. Above deck, a strange unease spread. The engines suddenly stopped. The rhythmic heartbeat of the Titanic went silent. People leaned over the rails, peering into the darkness. Nothing but the endless black sea. No one could see the iceberg drifting away into the shadows. Its deadly work already done. Captain Edward Smith rushed to the bridge. "What have we struck?" "An iceberg, sir." "Close the watertight doors." The command echoed through the ship. Massive steel doors groaned shut, sealing the flooding compartments in a desperate attempt to keep the Titanic afloat. For a moment, it seemed to work. The ship steadied. The crew breathed a sigh of relief. But then came Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer. He had already inspected the damage. 5 compartments were flooding, one after another, and he knew the truth. The Titanic could only survive if 4 compartments flooded. 5 meant death. He turned to the captain, his face pale and still. "The ship will sink." Captain Smith froze. "How long?" "An hour and a half, maybe 2. The words hung in the air like ice. The unsinkable ship? Sinking? Impossible. Unthinkable. Yet the water didn't care what man thought possible. In the first-class corridor, passengers stepped out of their cabins in silk robes and slippers. Curious about the faint tilt in the floor, stewards reassured them it was just a precaution. A few passengers even laughed. The band continued playing in the lounge, light tunes to calm the guests. Below deck, panic had already begun. Steerage passengers, mostly immigrants, were locked behind gates and steel doors. Their passageways flooding fast, they pounded on the barriers, crying for help in a dozen languages. Some crew tried to guide them upward. Others followed orders to keep them contained. In the wireless room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride sent out a distress signal. "CQD, CQD, Titanic struck iceberg. Require immediate assistance." It was the first SOS the world had ever heard. Miles away, the Carpathia received the call and turned its bow toward the Titanic. But it was hours away. Help wouldn't arrive in time. Back on deck, the air grew colder. The ship's bow was sinking slowly, tilting the deck just enough for glasses to slide off tables. A group of men gathered near the railings, peering down into the dark water. A few chunks of ice lay scattered across the deck. Someone picked one up, laughing. "I'll save this as a souvenir." Nearby, a steward handed out life jackets, but most passengers refused them. They still didn't understand. After all, this was the Titanic. How could it sink? At midnight, the captain gave the order no one ever expected. Prepare the lifeboats. Each lifeboat could hold about 60 people, but many crewmen didn't believe the ship was truly in danger. They hesitated, launching them half empty. The first boat left with only 28 aboard. Some women refused to leave their husbands behind. Others thought it safer to stay on the great ship than risk the open sea. The orchestra played on, soft and calm, the sound floating over the deck like a lullaby against chaos. Their music was meant to bring comfort, and in a strange way, it did. People clung to the illusion of control. Below, the water crept higher, cabins flooded, corridors turned into rivers. The lights flickered as generators strained. Children cried in the cold. Mothers whispered prayers. In the bow, young Maggie, the Irish girl from 3rd class, was waist deep in freezing water. She held her friend's hand, searching desperately for a way up the stairs. Each door she found was locked. The gate to the upper deck was barred. She screamed for help, her voice lost in the roar of the sea. Meanwhile, in 1st class, men argued with officers about boarding boats. One asked, "Is this really necessary?" The officer answered quietly, "Yes, sir, it's necessary." The great ship groaned as it tilted further. Plates bent, glass shattered. The ocean was pulling her down inch by inch. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips kept sending signals. He refused to stop, even as the floor began to slant beneath him. When another ship finally replied, he whispered, "God bless you." Above, Captain Smith walked the bridge, silent and calm. He knew the truth. The Titanic was lost, but duty held him steady. He watched as lifeboats disappeared into the Black Sea, each one a fragile hope against an impossible fate. By 12:30 a.m., water was flooding the grand staircase. The ship, that once sparkled with gold and crystal, was now a river of icy black. Furniture floated, paintings tore from walls, yet the band still played. Passengers gathered near the deck rails, some praying, others staring in disbelief. The stars above seemed cruelly bright, shining over a tragedy that hadn't yet finished unfolding. At 12:45 a.m., the last flare shot into the sky, a blazing red arc that vanished into the darkness. No nearby ship saw it. No one came. The Titanic's bow sank deeper, lifting the stern high into the air. The deck angled sharply. People clung to railings, slid across the tilted floor, screaming as they fell into the freezing water below. Still, some clung to hope. Still, some whispered, "She can't sink." But nature doesn't bargain. And in the heart of that silent ocean, the greatest ship ever built was fighting its final battle. Not against time, not against the sea, but against belief itself. The Titanic had collided not only with an iceberg, but with human arrogance. The belief that man could build something too strong to fall. And now, as cold Atlantic water swallowed its decks, that belief was dying 1 inch at a time. Midnight bled into the early minutes of a new day, and with it came the understanding that the Titanic was no longer a ship. She was a clock. Every creak of steel, every ripple against her plates, was another second slipping away. The bow sank almost imperceptibly, but enough that glasses slid across tables. Doors no longer swung true, and footsteps tilted toward the forward end like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Word spread unevenly, like a rumor fighting its way through thick velvet. Some heard it in a whisper, "We've struck ice." Others met it as a command, life jackets on, women and children to the boats. But most felt it first, before they understood it. The cold pushing through the deck, the silence of the engines, the strange angle of the world. Stewards knocked softly at cabin doors with forced smiles, their voices clipped and calm. "Just a precaution, madam. Life jacket on over your coat. Bring a blanket. No need for luggage." The sentences fell like snowflakes, light, gentle, covering the ground without a sound. Behind those smiles calculation sharpened. Behind those calm hands, tremor. In first class, silk robes met cork vests. Diamonds flashed against rough canvas. There was a bustle of questions, the nervous laughter of people accustomed to control. Surely this won't take long. We'll be back before the tea cools. Husbands helped wives with ties and straps, soothing them with assurances they didn't quite believe. Wives kissed their husbands' cheeks, certain this was only theater. No one imagined a scene so grand could end in anything but applause. Below that glittering calm, steerage fought water and gates. Narrow corridors funneled families toward doors they weren't permitted to pass. Mothers clutched babies, men shoved trunks against surging water to buy a few more minutes. Voices rose in Irish, Italian, Swedish, words braided with the same fear. A few crewmen did what they could, guiding, unlocking when they dared. But the machine of class still ground its slow, senseless gears. Salvation, it seemed, had organized seating. On the bridge, Captain Edward Smith stood with Thomas Andrews, and both men had left hope behind. Andrews had the numbers. The Atlantic had the proof. 5 compartments flooded. The lines on his drawing board had become real water, rising fast. He spoke quietly, almost reverently, as if reading a prayer instead of a verdict. She will go down by the head. The lights will hold as long as the dynamos remain above the waterline. Get them to the boats. The captain nodded once. Orders moved like lightning, without thunder. Officers took their stations. Charles Lightoller on the port side, William Murdoch on starboard. Women and children first became more than a phrase. It became law, a hard edge in the mouth of every man who believed the rule could stand between order and panic. The boats were swung out, their ropes groaning as cold worked into fibers. Lanterns threw yellow halos over faces that looked suddenly older. The orchestra set up again, as if summoned by an invisible hand. Violins found a waltz, not a funeral hymn. Not yet. Something light enough to keep the crowd's pulse from galloping. The music traveled the length of the deck like warm breath on glass. People smiled at them, grateful, as if a song could guarantee tomorrow. A flare went up, a red flower in the iron-black skies. The petals opened, hung, died in silence. Another and another, each an exclamation mark no one nearby would read. The closest ship's lights were rumored, guessed, imagined. A flicker beyond the horizon, a whisper of hope, too thin to hold. The first boats began to lower. Boat by boat, the arithmetic turned from abstract to human. 65 seats, 30 souls, 40 seats, 12 souls. Officers, worried about the drop, the swell, the chaos that might follow a false move, erred on emptiness. Some women refused to step in without their husbands. Some husbands lied, "I'll catch the next, see? Plenty of boats." The kind of lie born not of malice, but of love and habit. They believed in a future where they still decided what happened next. A boy stood at the rail, his fingers white around the wood, hair stuck to his forehead with frost. His mother kept telling him to breathe through his nose, to keep warm, as if warmth could be willed. A steward tried a joke he didn't feel. The boy looked at the water like it was an animal with many mouths. The wireless room throbbed with urgency. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride hammered out the same message over and over, the 3 letters that had just entered the world's vocabulary, SOS. They stacked coordinates on top of coordinates, threw urgency like a rope into the dark. Replies came thin, faint, delayed. The Carpathia turned. More than 3 hours out, the Californian, so close by that rumor said its lamps were visible, slept in radio silence. There is a special cruelty in being almost heard. Time tightened. The angle sharpened. China slid off shelves with a polite shatter. In the grand staircase, the dome still glowed, as if daylight could be coaxed from electricity forever. The palm court looked like a stage after a performance. Chairs skewed. Programs abandoned. A woman paused to straighten a tablecloth. Some people fight chaos with small acts of order, and then let it go, realizing her hands were shaking too hard to make the corners meet. On the starboard side, boat 7 went down half-filled, its lantern swinging like a small star. Murdoch urged more forward, but the crowd held back, clinging to the ship's size as evidence of its safety. "We'll be called back any minute," someone said. "They're testing the boats," said another. The Titanic still looked whole. That was her last and most dangerous illusion. On port, Lightollers' jaw set. His interpretation of the rule hardened. Women and children only. A man tried to step forward and was pushed back with a word that landed like a blow. Some protested, some saluted, some simply stepped away. The decision made for them by the shape of their upbringing. A Swedish father placed his daughter into the boat, and with a nod that held everything he could not say, stepped back into the line of men who would not follow. Below, water wrote its own history. It found the mailroom lifting sacks like sodden lungs. It found the Turkish baths, the gymnasium where earlier a man had marveled at a mechanical horse, the squash court that now hosted a crueler game. It found staterooms and photographs, and a drawer filled with letters no one would send. The Atlantic is a meticulous archivist. It keeps what it takes. Thomas Andrews moved through first class, like a doctor walking a ward, insisting on life jackets, insisting on the truth, with a voice that never rose and never lied. He urged women to the boats, with a courtesy so firm it could not be refused. When one asked, "Will we return after the drill?" he hesitated just long enough for her to understand. Some truths are spoken by silence. The band shifted to a hymn, not yet the hymn, but something with the shape of confession. A few sang along, their voices thin with cold. 2 sailors wrestled with a davit, frozen by spray, working the metal with bare hands until the skin tore. An officer checked his watch, not because it mattered, but because ritual can make a man feel less like he's drowning. There were moments of grace that looked at first like madness. A man stepped back from an empty seat and urged a stranger forward. "For your child," he said, and met his own fate with eyes that had just chosen it. A newlywed refused to leave her husband. "Where you go, I go," she said, and the words settled between them like a vow repeated at the gates of winter. An elderly couple sat together on a bench, their shoulders touching, speaking of summers, of gardens, of small birds that drank from stone basins. They had traveled so far to end up exactly where they promised they would. A flare hissed skyward and died. A baby began to cry, thin, furious, alive, and a circle of hands closed around the sound, building a shield of wool and breath and human heat. Another boat lowered, rope paying out in jerks, the hull kissing the sea with a thud that made everyone flinch. Oars bit into black water. A woman looked back at the ship and covered her mouth, as if to keep her heart inside. The bridge was colder now. Frost formed on the brass. a delicate script writing itself over instruments that had promised certainty. Captain Smith stared forward at nothing. He had the look of a man who knows the ending, but must still turn each page. He gave few orders now. The ship had entered a chapter where will mattered less than weight and water. In the smoking lounge, a fire still burned with the stubbornness of cultivated comfort. A handful of men sat as if for an after-dinner conversation, their backs straight, their eyes traveling without settling. One lifted his glass in a gesture too practiced to abandon. "To the engineers," he said softly, and if anyone answered, it was with the quiet tilt of a head. Below, those engineers kept the dynamos alive, hands on valves, boots in water, buying light with minutes. The lamps burned because they stayed. Steerage finally broke upward in waves. Gates opened. Barriers yielded to effort and anger. A surge of humanity climbed stairs and spilled into air sharp as knives. Faces whitened by cold, and fear met faces whitened by disbelief. For one brief, honest heartbeat, class dissolved into a single expression. The look people wear when they understand how small they are beneath the sky. Boat after boat creaked away, some fuller now, officers learning the hard arithmetic of time. A few men slipped in when no one watched. A few were pulled in by hands that chose mercy over law. Children were passed like precious parcels from arm to arm. Names were shouted and lost. The list to starboard deepened. Railings tilted into ladders. The music found nearer, my God, to thee. And perhaps it was only the melody's outline. Perhaps it was another hymn with similar bones. But people heard what they needed to hear. A hush fell that wasn't silence. It was the brief, fragile peace of acceptance, as if the night itself had taken a breath. Harold Bride, weary and young, told Phillips to rest. Phillips refused and sent again. The key clacked like hail on a tin roof. Carpathia answered, "Coming, coming," as if the word could push the ocean back. The distance remained what it was. Hope holds, even when math does not. Andrews stood once more in the first-class foyer and pressed life jackets into elegant hands, now blue at the knuckles. He was seen later in the smoking room, staring at a painting of Plymouth Harbor, eyes fixed not on the ship in the image, but on the soft edge of land beyond it. Perhaps he was measuring, the way a builder measures a span he cannot cross. Wind found its voice. It moved across the emptying deck like a scout, reporting back to the sea. The bow, heavier now with rooms turned to reservoirs, dipped enough that water licked the edge of the well deck with a cat's patience. The stern lifted a few feet higher, showing lines that designers had drawn to be appreciated in daylight by proud men on quays. A final cluster of passengers hesitated at the rail, torn between steel and canvas, between size and sense. An officer leaned close, his breath a cloud. "There will be no second call," he said, and gentled them over the side. The boat swung, dropped, kissed, and was away, its oars setting a rhythm that sounded, to those still aboard, like the ticking of a clock in the next room. Realization settled at last, not like thunder, but like snow, covering everything in equal measure, touching the jeweled and the barefoot, the fluent and the halting, the dutiful and the defiant. The ship that had promised supremacy over nature had taught a different lesson, that nature keeps its own counsel and time keeps its own books. Men straightened their coats, women tightened scarves around children's ears. A few prayed with lips that could barely feel the shapes of words. Others stared into the middle distance, as if watching a play they knew by heart but could not alter. The decks were emptier now. The lights still burned. The Atlantic waited without hurry. When the last of the easier choices had been made, and the last of the gentler boats had gone, the Titanic exhaled a long, deep sigh that no one heard and everyone felt. It ran through the length of her, through carpets and copper, through mahogany and bone. It was the sound of a great truth finishing its sentence. Night kept its stars, the sea kept its glass, and aboard the greatest ship ever built, realization finished its work and made way for the next chapter. Not caution, not preparation, but survival. Raw, immediate, unadorned. The night had grown mercilessly cold. By 1:30 a.m., the Titanic was no longer the ship of dreams. She was a battlefield without guns or soldiers, only fear, freezing air, and time running out. The deck, once glittering with laughter and music, was now chaos wrapped in moonlight. The tilt of the ship was undeniable. You couldn't pretend anymore. What had been a gentle slope was now a climb. Men stumbled while helping women to lifeboats. Children cried into coats that no longer kept them warm. Every breath turned white. Clouds that vanished into the night, just like the people who made them. The band still played. Their notes trembled through the frozen air. Soft, haunting, brave. They weren't playing for hope anymore. They were playing for peace, for courage, for memory. They knew it. Everyone knew it. There weren't enough lifeboats. Even if every single one was filled to the edge, more than 1,000 people would still be left behind. That truth fell across the ship like a shadow no one could escape. Down on the starboard side, an officer shouted, "Lower away!" A lifeboat creaked, swinging out into black water 40 feet below. The rope hissed through pulleys. A woman screamed. Her husband had tried to follow her in, but an officer blocked him. Women and children only. He pushed back. The officer drew his revolver. The man froze, eyes wide, realizing this wasn't a rule anymore. It was survival law. He stepped back, trembling. His wife reached out as her boat dropped away, her voice breaking on the wind. They would never see each other again. All along the deck, lanterns swung from hooks, throwing circles of light across faces pale with disbelief. It wasn't panic that filled the air now. It was shock, that deep, paralyzing disbelief that comes when everything you thought was safe turns on you. The Titanic groaned like something alive. Metal stretched, bolts popped. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through bone. The front of the ship, the bow, had already slipped underwater. The stern lifted higher, inch by inch, towering over the sea like a wounded beast refusing to die. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips still tapped out messages, his fingers numb, his breath shallow. "Come quick. We are sinking fast." Harold Bride tried to wrap a blanket around his shoulders, but Phillips wouldn't stop. He refused to stop. The electric hum of the transmitter was the only sound left that felt alive. The Carpathia had replied. They were coming, but they were 4 hours away. 4 hours, and the Titanic didn't have one. Back on deck, the wind sliced through everything. The temperature had fallen to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Below freezing, the air burned the lungs. The ocean itself was ablaze. The lifeboats, scattered now across the waves, bobbed in the blackness. Tiny, fragile islands surrounded by the screams of those still aboard. Inside those boats, silence grew heavy. People huddled together, watching the ship that once made them feel invincible, now dying before their eyes. One woman covered her face and whispered, "She looks beautiful." And she did. Even in death, the Titanic was majestic, her lights still glowing, her name still shining, but the glow was fading, and the bow was almost gone. On the forward deck, passengers clung to railings. Some tried to climb higher, others simply stood still, staring into the distance, as if waiting for dawn. A priest knelt with a small group, praying softly, "Lord, into thy hands." The words were lost beneath the wind. A few jumped. The splash below was sharp, then silence. The water didn't forgive. It hit like concrete. The shock so violent, it stopped hearts instantly. Those who survived the first seconds found the cold unbearable. The breath left their lungs. Within minutes, muscles froze. Voices faltered. The screams came, then faded into the dark, one by one. At 1:50 a.m., the last of the lifeboats was lowered. Boat 4, half full. There were still hundreds left on board. Women clutching children, men pacing, crew shouting orders. No one could follow anymore. Everywhere you looked, confusion. Some still believed rescue was minutes away. Some had given up. Captain Smith walked the bridge one final time. He said nothing. He simply looked at his ship, his pride, his life's work, and then at the Black Sea, waiting below. Witnesses later said he went into the wheelhouse and closed the door. He was never seen again. Below, in the boiler rooms, the engineers fought to keep the lights on. They knew they wouldn't make it out, but they stayed. They kept the power flowing so the passengers above could see, could hope, could live a few minutes longer. Their courage went unnoticed, but without them, the Titanic would have vanished into darkness long before the end. At 2:05 a.m., the ship's list grew steeper. People slid across the deck, grabbing at rails at each other. Water surged up the grand staircase, swallowing the velvet and brass in a single rush. Furniture crashed, glass shattered. A grand piano floated briefly before being crushed against a wall. And still, the band played. Now the song was clear. "Nearer, my God, to thee." The melody wavered through the freezing wind, carried across the sea. Even in the lifeboats far away, survivors heard it. Soft, trembling, but beautiful. That sound would haunt them forever. A man stood at the stern, holding his wife's hand. She wore no coat, no hat, just her nightgown and a life jacket. He whispered something to her, and she nodded. Then they jumped together. Others followed, leaping from the stern as it rose higher and higher. The ship tilted almost 45 degrees now, a steel mountain rising into the stars. People clung to whatever they could, railings, pipes, bolts, anything that still stood between them and the sea. At 2:18 a.m., the ship began to break. The sound was like thunder under the water, metal twisting, splitting, tearing apart. The lights flickered, then went out. In that blackness, the Titanic's body gave way. The bow, heavy and full of water, broke free and plunged into the deep. The stern rose higher, completely vertical, and for a moment, just a moment, it hung there, silhouetted against the stars. Then gravity took her. The great ship slid down, slow at first, then faster, dragging hundreds with her, their screams swallowed by the cold, and then silence. The ocean, once cut by the Titanic's proud bow, was now still again, the sky unchanged, the stars indifferent, the sea black and endless. For the next 20 minutes, the water was filled with voices, hundreds calling for help, men shouting names, women crying for children, and then, one by one, those voices faded until only the wind remained. In the lifeboats, people sat motionless, too stunned to cry, too cold to move. The survivors watched as the last bubbles rose and disappeared. No one spoke, even those who prayed did so in silence, because no words felt right after what they had seen. The Titanic, the unsinkable ship, was gone. Hours later, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the Carpathia arrived. They found the lifeboats scattered across the sea, and the survivors staring toward an empty ocean. Nothing remained. No ship, no music, no light, only debris and the silence of loss. Of more than 2,000 people, only 706 survived. The rest were gone, claimed by water colder than mercy itself. They said the Titanic was a triumph of human engineering, and it was. But that night, the ocean reminded mankind of something far older, far greater, that nature doesn't bow to our pride, that the sea doesn't care how rich you are, how powerful your ship, or how many believed it couldn't sink. And maybe that's the real reason the story still haunts us. Because deep down, we know that if we had been there, standing under that same sky, feeling that same cold, we might not have survived either. The ocean was calm again. Too calm. By the time the last voice faded into the night, the Titanic had already vanished beneath 2 miles of icy black water. The ship that began her journey as the unsinkable miracle now rested at the bottom of the Atlantic, torn in two, surrounded by darkness and silence. All that remained above were fragments, lifeboats drifting aimlessly, wood debris, a floating chair, a child's doll, and the survivors, huddled together, trembling, watching the horizon that refused to change. They waited for dawn, but dawn was cruelly slow. In the lifeboats, no one spoke. Some whispered prayers, some rocked quietly, staring at their hands, as if trying to convince themselves they were still alive. Others stared at the sea, the same sea that had taken their families, their friends, their entire world, and said nothing. The stars still burned, bright and indifferent, the same stars that watched the Titanic rise from Southampton now watched her grave. A few survivors could still hear echoes, faint, fading, as if the sea itself remembered the screams. One man whispered, "Listen, they're still calling." But there were no more voices, only the wind. In one lifeboat, a young mother clutched her baby so tightly her knuckles turned white. The child slept, too small to understand the horror that surrounded them. Beside her, a man stared into the dark, his face stiff with shock. He had given up his seat to his wife and daughter, both now gone. He didn't cry. He just waited, like everyone else, for the sun. When dawn finally came, it arrived like a ghost, soft, pale, almost ashamed to touch what the night had done. The horizon glowed faint gold, and in that fragile light, the truth appeared. Everywhere, bodies, dozens, then hundreds, floating in their life jackets, faces turned to the sky. The ocean, calm and flat, held them gently, as if tucking them into eternal rest. Survivors covered their eyes. Some whispered names, others simply looked away. And then, out of the mist, a shape, a ship, the Carpathia. For the survivors, that sight was more than hope. It was resurrection. Flares shot up, weak and trembling, hands waved, voices cracked, Crewmen on the Carpathia shouted back, lowering ropes and ladders. As each survivor was pulled aboard, cheers mixed with sobs, but joy was not the sound that filled the air. It was disbelief. It was grief that had no words. The decks of the Carpathia became a portrait of heartbreak. Blankets wrapped around shivering shoulders. Doctors moved from one collapsed figure to another. Children cried for parents who would never answer. Women clutched photographs, soaked and torn, pressing them to their hearts, as if the ink could still be alive. One sailor looked across the water and whispered, "She's gone." And somewhere inside every survivor, a voice answered, "Yes, but I'm still here." And that was the cruelest truth of all, to live when so many hadn't. In New York, when the Carpathia finally arrived, the dock was silent, no cheers, no celebration, only waiting families, faces pale in the fog, searching the faces of survivors for someone who never came off the ship. The world called it a tragedy, but for those who lived it, tragedy wasn't a big enough word. They'd left behind more than people. They'd left behind an entire world. A belief that mankind could outbuild nature, outthink danger, outlive consequence. The Titanic shattered that belief, because when she sank, something deeper sank with her, our illusion of control. Years later, survivors still spoke of that night. They remembered the cold, the music, the stars, how quiet the world became when the ship's lights finally went out. Some never went near the sea again. Others spent their lives trying to explain what it felt like to watch a miracle die. They said the sound of the ship breaking in two wasn't the loudest thing. It was the silence that followed, a silence that never truly left them. More than a century has passed, but the Titanic's story refuses to rest. It's more than a shipwreck now. It's a mirror, showing us who we are when our pride meets reality. Because that night wasn't just about ice and water. It was about choice, courage, sacrifice, and the haunting truth that when everything collapses, we all face the same ocean. So ask yourself this: if you had been there, on that freezing deck, under that endless sky, with the sea climbing closer every second, what would you have done? Would you have stayed calm, helped others, or fought for one more breath? Comment below and tell me, would you have survived the Titanic's final night, or would the ocean have taken you too? The Titanic didn't just sink. It taught us something humanity still struggles to remember. No matter how powerful we think we are, nature always has the final word. That night in 1912 wasn't just a disaster. It was a mirror held up to mankind's pride. Some met their fate with courage, others with fear, but all were equal beneath the same frozen stars. The ship may rest at the bottom of the Atlantic, but her story still lives in every question we ask, in every heartbeat that wonders, what would I have done? So tell me, honestly, if you were there that night, standing on that tilting deck, watching the stars disappear beneath the sea, would you have survived? Comment below and share your thoughts. And stay tuned, because next time we're diving into another night the world will never forget.